All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us virtually for the second of our five-part series, Decarceration as a Response to COVID-19. In case you weren't able to join for our first installment, each webinar will address how the county's response to COVID-19 is not just about flattening the curve of infection rates, but also about inequities that are exacerbated by this pandemic. Before we begin, we have a few logistical and programmatic notes about how our evening will be structured. So first, we'd like to acknowledge that this webinar does not have ASL interpretation available. We apologize for not being able to offer this service, but we are actively working towards making interpretation available for subsequent webinars. And more updates on that will hopefully be shared soon. Tonight, we are offering Spanish interpretation. Please dial 605-313-4162 for Spanish audio and mute your computer. And please feel free to write down your questions and comments in Spanish as well. To help with our Spanish interpretation, we have Andrea Rocha, who is doing live interpretation for Spanish speakers, and David Trujillo, Advocacy Director at ACLU San Diego and Imperial Counties, who will help with live translating questions in Spanish into English. David, if you don't mind now, could you please repeat the instructions in Spanish?
Esta noche estamos ofreciendo interpretación en español. Marque al 605-313-4162 con el código de acceso 724673 y el símbolo del gato. Para audio en español y silencie su computadora y su teléfono. Si tiene una pregunta para un panelista, envíe su pregunta con el botón preguntas y respuestas o las letras Q y A. No dude en escribir sus preguntas y comentarios en español. Gracias.
Thanks, David. And for our attendees, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll notice a few features that will be helpful to you during the evening. If you have a question for one of our panelists, please submit your question using the Q&A button. It will be helpful if you can include who your question is directed to, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible, but may not get to all of them given the time constraints. Separately from the Q&A button, you'll notice there's a chat box. All messages sent to the chat box can only be seen by panelists, and attendees will not be able to message each other in this webinar. If you'd like to send affirmations or commentary to our panelists, you're welcome to do that in the chat. And if you have any technical difficulties, you can also put those in the chat, and someone monitoring for technical questions will assist you if you need help. But again, if you have a question for one of the panelists, please submit the question using the Q&A button. Finally, when you leave the webinar, you'll be directed to a survey asking for your feedback. Please share your feedback with us so we can improve this experience for others on subsequent webinars. Finally, to go over the agenda for tonight, we're covering three issue areas. The first is immigration detention. The second is incarceration during COVID-19, and the third is local policing issues. There will be two periods where we'll do a Q&A session with our panelists, and at the end of the webinar, our panelists will share how you all can take action on the issues that you'll hear about tonight. So I'll just kick us off then. Flatten the curve of inequality, decarceration as a response to COVID-19. During this pandemic, a lot of information and stories have been shared about how people, business, and schools have had to adapt to prioritize health and safety concerns. But what about our jails and immigration detention centers? No one should be forced to live in conditions that endanger their lives during this public health crisis. Everyone in our region should have the ability to follow health experts' recommendations to protect themselves during this pandemic. Today, our panelists will share what local government response to COVID-19, and in particular local issues that exist within detention centers, jails, and law enforcement agencies. So I hope you'll all join me in welcoming virtually our panelists. Our first panelist is Layla Aziz. She's Program Director at Pillars of the Community. Pillars of the Community is a grassroots organization that works with community members in Southeast San Diego on decriminalization work. They do this through policy, leadership development, civic engagement, and community building. Pillars has registered over 10,000 low propensity voters in Southeast San Diego and has outreach to over 1,000 community members for the 2020 census. Pillars programs focus on issues like police and court accountability. Layla is also a law student. Our second panelist is Chelsea Birgisdottir. She's a policy associate with ACLU of San Diego and Imperial counties. Her policy and advocacy focus is primarily on police accountability and transparency, as well as on surveillance issues. Before joining the ACLU, she worked on civil forfeiture campaigns as an organizer in the Bronx and lobbied California legislators on police use of force bills as an ACLU precinct captain. She also trained full-time as a professional rugby player on the U.S. Olympic women's rugby sevens team. Although prematurely sidelined from playing rugby due to injury, she is fueled by the police accountability work that she does now with coalition partners and community members, whether it's working on addressing racial and identity disparities in police stops and searches, or giving Know Your Rights presentations to communities in San Diego. Our third panelist is Esmeralda Flores. She's the Immigration and Binational Affairs Advocate for the ACLU SDIC. Esmeralda conducts extensive outreach in Mexico for the San Diego ACLU's Lopez Venegas v. Johnson settlement that challenged government policy on voluntary returns. And for the past 4 years before joining the ACLU, she worked as a staff attorney with the Binational Defense and Advocacy Program housed at the Casa del Migrante in Tijuana, Mexico. Her focus was on the documentation of human and civil rights violations and family separation issues due to deportations. And in 2013, she presented a friend of the court brief before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. She's a graduate of the University Autónoma de Baja California School of Law. She also completed a postgrad international migration program at the prestigious Colegio de Frontera Norte in Tijuana. And last but not least, we have Dinora Reyes, who's the executive director of the San Diego Organizing Project. Dinora joined SDOP in 2014 as an organizer working 5 churches across San Diego County. During that time, Dinora led SDOP's voter engagement work and helped launch the San Diego Rapid Response Network in 2017 to protect undocumented immigrants from raids by Immigration and Customs Enforcement and Customs and Border Protection. Reina is currently a steering committee member of the Rapid Response Network and led a volunteer effort to help pass the Safe Schools and Neighborhoods Act, which reduced poverty-related felonies to misdemeanors. For that campaign based in South San Diego, SDOP leaders knocked on more than 20,000 doors. In 2017, Reina led 300 faith leaders to call for the effective implementation of SB 54, the California Values Act, limiting local and state law enforcement from acting as deportation agents in San Diego. Thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. So first, we're going to address immigration. And so this question I am directing to Esmeralda and Dinora. In this region, we have 2 detention centers, Otay Mesa and Imperial Regional Detention Facility. Both of those are run in partnership with private companies. Otay Mesa recently made headlines nationwide as a detention facility with the most COVID-19 positive cases. Esmeralda, can you talk about recent efforts to release individuals from immigration detention in San Diego and Imperial counties? And can you also touch on why decarceration is a response during a pandemic?
Sure. Welcome, everyone. Well, we believe that decarceration as a response to COVID-19 will save lives. We know that CDC guidelines for social distancing and hygiene are impossible to comply with in both settings, whether it's in immigration or in a jail, because people share toilets, cells, and other things. So people who are incarcerated, whether it's in immigration or in a jail, they always face heightened risk of COVID-19 infection. And mass incarceration not only risks the health and safety of the people who work in these facilities, it also risks the communities that they return home to. When it comes to here in our region, as you mentioned, we have 2 detention centers. For example, Otay Mesa Detention Center has a capacity for almost 2,000 people, and there are 2 groups that are held in Otay Mesa. One group is under the custody of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, and the second group is under the custody of the U.S. Marshal Service. Those in U.S. Marshal's custody are federal criminal defendants being held before trial. So far, and this number may be a little outdated, we know that at least 70 people tested positive for COVID-19. And our office is co-counsel, the ACLU of San Diego and Imperial counties is co-counsel in a lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of the federal government's continued imprisonment of people in Otay Mesa. Unfortunately, we haven't had a positive outcome we recently lost two early motions for emergency relief. They were denied. The latest one was denied this past Sunday by Judge Sobra. And when it comes to the people who are under ICE's custody, our affiliate has led two legal cases against Otay Mesa and the Imperial Regional Detention Center. We know that at least 160 people have tested positive and 11 staff from Otay Mesa Detention Center. We believe that 3 detainees at Imperial and 9 staff have also tested positive. So first, we demanded the release of 4 clients, and all of them we were successful, so they were released, and we had to dismiss our lawsuit back in early April. But on April 21st, our legal team filed a class action lawsuit in the U.S. District Court to demand a drastic reduction of the number of people who were held in Otay Mesa Detention Center, and it also including Imperial Regional Detention Facility. The lawsuit mainly sought the immediate release of people who are medically vulnerable to COVID-19. We were successful, and luckily, in total, 96 people were released from Otay Mesa Detention Center and 4 people from the Imperial Detention Center. So 100 people total so far have been released thanks to these efforts from our legal team. We continue to monitor Otay Mesa and Imperial Detention, and we continue to submit mitigation packets on behalf of 32 people who are high at risk, but the judge denied their release due to mainly past crimes. We continue to fight to reduce the number of detainees in both detention centers and in the U.S. Marshal's custody, especially those who are vulnerable to COVID-19. We are assessing our next steps, and we will continue to fight for the humane treatment for people in detention during this unprecedented pandemic. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Esmeralda. That's a really sobering reality that you shared, but also really inspiring to hear about all your efforts to decarcerate detention centers during this important time. Denora, could you move on and tell us what happens to people after they're released from detention, and also talk about the support that SDOP has been providing? And also, what are the challenges that you've faced in providing this kind of support during a pandemic?
Hi, thank you for having me today. Sure. So our role, I think, and so San Diego Organizing Project works with approximately 30 congregations across the county. And I think in the recent years and based upon or as a consequence of administration changes and policy changes upon the release of detainees, folks no longer have a secured place to go or a process where there is intentional effort to get them to their loved ones once they're in this country. So SDOP and really faith leaders across the county have stepped in, and I think primarily through the work of throughout the Rapid Response Network and creating accompaniment teams within congregations. We don't have a formal program, but it's really been already existing social justice ministries across the county from our member congregations that have taken, I think, personal roles and commitment to serve as sponsoring families. We've had a couple of, so upon release, detainee potentially, especially if they are single males or single females, would have a more difficult time finding shelter. And so we have served as a partner to several organizations, ACLU included, when there are cases of single folks and sometimes even families who don't have a place to go and probably need shelter or sponsorship for a couple weeks or a specific amount of time. We've had there's a lovely couple in a congregation in North County who is currently sponsoring a young woman from Central America who had a sponsor, a point of contact, and when she finally arrived and was processed, no longer had contact with the person that she expected to receive her. So that family committed to to sponsoring her, and I think, and through their entire congregation, have created a network of families that are supporting needs for food. There was a big need for dental and healthcare, and they recently were working through different agencies with the help of other nonprofit organizations to get her the medical care that she needed. So I believe that the role of faith leaders for folks that are released and face challenges and needs is really to be the connectors and to create networks inside their congregations that are filling the needs or the gaps that our current system just doesn't have, and hasn't created a system to really support people and create the wraparound services that migrants need once they're in this country. So we've had a couple of stories, and currently a couple of families that are sponsoring. In addition to, we have some faith leaders that are also spending their ministry inside their congregations, doing visitations inside detention centers. So there's been a lot of collection of stories from their visits that have been shared, and I think our effort is to do the listening through deep relationship and be of help to the litigation organizations that are bringing those stories to the courts. So I think ultimately the sacred space, and I think the deep relationship that exists inside congregations really serve as a bridge, I would say, between the community and the faith community that's willing to help. And we know there's a lot of people that are willing to help out there, but I think the connection to organizations like ACLU, like others that are providing services and litigation for migrants, the faith community has been able to really be the one that's bridging between those two sectors. I don't know if I missed another question, Adriana. Is there something else?
No, thank you so much for sharing, and also thank you for all the work that you're doing to coordinate supports during this time. I think now we're going to move to Q&A, and just to remind attendees, the way that you can submit a question for our panelists is to go to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and click that, and so you can start submitting questions now. We already have one question for Esme, which is, what are some possible next steps to decarcerate local detention centers?
Yes, of course, thank you. As I mentioned, our litigation is still ongoing to get the most people out of immigration detention as we can. Another way that folks can help is donating to local bail funds. The bail set during like an immigration process can be really, really high and not accessible. As we know, it's an issue with bail overall. So that's another thing that folks can get involved. The other thing, and we're gonna talk about this too, but we're trying to put pressure on local leadership at OTMSA and ICE to make sure they're releasing the most people that they can to protect everyone's safeguard.
Thank you. And if I can just ask a follow-up question from our audience, what impact, if any, will the bill that Governor Newsom recently signed restricting private prisons have on these detention centers?
That's a really good question. It's kind of a long one. The bill only applies it doesn't apply retroactively. So the detention centers that we already have, they are still continue to be in place. But the bill also prohibits the creation of new detention centers. One challenge that we had is that a lot of these detention centers are run by private companies, and a lot of them submitted and got approved some plans to either expand or create new detention centers in California. And that's something that a lot of organizations, including the ACLU, are trying to fight against.
Thank you. Denor, we have a question for you, which is, who more precisely is serving as the primary clearinghouse or coordinating agency for connecting people released from detention with possible sponsors, whether that's for temporary or long-term help? Is that a function of the Rapid Response Network?
I realized as I was reading that question too that I didn't answer what the challenges were. And so I think one of the biggest challenges is that there isn't one. There isn't an agency or organization that's the primary connector. And quite frankly, it's been because of deep relational work that's existed and continuously happening throughout organizations and sectors, even, I would say. So there isn't a primary coordinating organization. I think it's all pretty much grassroots efforts and relational work that's been consistent and had to be persistent about. And so there isn't anything coordinated, unfortunately, which is one of the biggest challenges.
Thank you. And so you mentioned in your comments the process of sponsoring through private parties within congregations. What does that entail exactly?
Right. So as I mentioned, there isn't a formal process. The families that have been connected to SDOP have been through either program managers or directors that have either a relationship in a congregation or directly with me or some of our staff inside our organizations. If I won't go in, I don't have the precise process, and I have a general, I could explain it generally, but I wouldn't want to provide inaccurate information. But generally, we've been able to connect families who have stepped up in emergency cases, which are the ones that we've been able to support, and actually have seeked out and relied on attorneys, primarily from the ACLU or other immigration attorneys that have been connected with the families to prepare and brief the potential sponsors that are willing to step up. So it takes a lot of work to really be able to define what it means and manage expectations and also present the entire potential process that could take 2 weeks, but also could take many months, if not longer. So we've had to create a whole network of organizations and experts around the region to be able to prepare the sponsors. And, a sponsorship could be very simple, but also for the family taking in, or the couple or the sponsors that are committing to do this, it's a big responsibility that requires a huge commitment. And so we've had to do a lot of intentional work and briefing and connecting to attorneys to make sure that those expectations are managed, and also that the commitment is clear. So I'm sorry that I don't have deeper or more precise information, but we've had to do everything really pretty grassroots and through relationship building.
Thank you. The next question is for both of you, whoever feels prepared to answer it. But our audience would like to know if there are children that have been separated from families in detention centers near San Diego as well.
Yeah, I can answer that. Family separation has always been an issue when it comes to immigration. It was highlighted because it was super intentional during the past couple of years. But unfortunately, for immigration purposes, a family unit, it's only considered as a biological parent with their minor child. So if we have stepfathers or stepmothers who are apprehended, they might get separated if they don't have enough documentation to prove that. If we have an older sister with their younger sibling, they might be separated too, as they're not considered technically a family unit under the current immigration definition that agencies have. We haven't heard of any recent cases in San Diego, luckily, and our lawsuit is starting to prevent that. But that's not something that we can say for sure.
Thank you. And do you also know, Esme, about how many detainees are presently at Otay Mesa?
We know that around, I think they're at 50% capacity because they had to implement some restrictions. And as I mentioned, our lawsuit got 100 people, 96 released from Otay Mesa. But we know that I think it's around 500 people, between 500 and 600 people right now. But I can provide that information in the chat later.
Thank you. Also, for both of you, whoever might have the answer to this question, do you know if the migrant shelter that's managed by Jewish Family Services has been closed? And is there any plan to reopen that facility or another one for this population?
I can answer that. So the migrant shelter, as of I believe the end of the month will no longer be open for receiving migrants as it was intended or created. And the reason is that upon the COVID-19 health crisis, there have not been any release of detainees. So there has been a repurposing of resources, and I think too, upon the direction of the state, to repurpose the resources and the infrastructure to respond to the COVID-19 needs. I believe, I don't know. I don't think that there is much information beyond that, but my understanding too is that there's an intention to conserve and preserve the infrastructure of the work that was, all of the efforts and work that was put into the creation of the shelter, in the case that there is a possibility to reopen.
Thank you for that information. Another question from the audience is about the impact of the Trump administration, and specifically on the appointment and conduct of immigration judges. Can either of you speak to what difference that's had, and maybe about procedural requirements for immigrants that may be trying to apply for asylum right now?
I can try to answer that question. I'm not an attorney in the US, so I haven't had direct experience in court. But we do know that immigration judges can make a difference, especially when it comes to individual cases and making sure folks are protected by the laws that we have for those who are seeking asylum and refuge in the US.
And I guess this might be our last question. One of our audience members says that one of the impressions that listeners to webinars like this get when they learn about all the great work that organizations like yours are doing is that they think all people who need help can be served by existing organizations, and that it's just a matter of hooking up a needy person with that organization. Is that your impression?
I think we both could answer this, but I'll just take at it. So there aren't enough resources in San Diego, and I think that there's really strong, powerful work that is currently existing, and that I think without it, we wouldn't be able to accomplish half of what has already been done. And quite frankly, and I think Esme might be able to add more to this, San Diego County alone does not receive the amount of resources, financial resources really, to provide services to migrants in our region, given that we are a border town, given many of the reasons that I could list, compared to other counties like LA and San Francisco. So given the border crisis and responding to that, San Diego County just has not been a priority for state funding or other funding to be able to respond with the magnitude and the needs that there are. So there is certainly incredible work that's happening, and I think that is needed. And I think that we've been able to accomplish as a region all of the work that we have because of the intentionality of working together. As many of us say, together we are much stronger and powerful, but there's certainly so much more. And I think that there's a huge role for the government to play at different levels, local and federal. But there's absolutely just not enough resources. There's not enough attorneys. There's not enough of many things. And so it's not as easy as just plugging someone in that's in need to an organization whose mission is aligned with that specific service, because there's just people, there aren't enough attorneys, there aren't enough resources, unfortunately. And I think that organizations are trying, but there's just simply not enough.
Thank you. I think now we're going to switch gears a little bit and take a deep dive into policing and enforcement during the pandemic. So, Layla and Esmeralda, I'm wondering if I can now ask you to talk about decarceration efforts in San Diego in light of COVID-19 in the criminal system, and why is being in a San Diego jail particularly dangerous for people inside?
You want to take that, Chelsea, or would you like me to? Okay, I'll take it. Well, we know that jail conditions are people that live very closely together. particularly in dorm settings. We know that even in the cells, sometimes there's about 7 people in a cell in a jail, much more than in a prison. And there are also things that are required or strongly asked for as far as hand sanitizing, and those things are illegal. They're considered contraband in jails. You can't have alcohol, which is the ingredient you need to make a hand sanitizer that works. Other issues are masks and how often can you get those masks, and the cleanliness of those masks, and the cleanliness of everything within that jail structure. People are touching things at all times. And so knowing this, we knew that this was going to be a petri dish of COVID-19 if something didn't happen. It was waiting to happen. And we saw some of the cases start early on. We worked with ACLU and about 30 other organizations to send a letter demanding the release of people early on to the district attorney and the sheriff's office. Shortly after, the judges did come down with a 0 bail schedule, requiring that people with nonviolent offenses are released. Our district attorney then came back and stated that they were going to hold over 100 of these individuals who should have been released, where the public defender had to actually go to the appellate courts to have these people released, saying that they were illegally being detained, and they lost. So our district attorney did her best in that entire office to maintain people that were being released throughout the state for certain offenses to make sure that they stayed within the jails in San Diego, and that was very problematic. It was, it's life or death to a lot of people. We had to begin calling one-on-one. We would get calls from families. We have participatory defense, which is a community organizing model to directly challenge criminal justice system and mass incarceration or mass elimination through families being the lead organizers. So families meet weekly and we discuss their loved one's case. We strategize and we provide court support and court watch. Because of that, we knew a lot of the people that were still in there. Families called, they would sometimes go on social media afraid, and people would direct them to us. And we would begin to ask. We have people in Vista and the actual medical center in Vista who had the same mask on for 7-8 days and weren't given another mask. We had people who didn't have masks for a good month until they started actually making the mask and people were donating the mask. So those were all issues that we saw coming. And fortunately, we did see a nice amount, not as many as I would have liked, of individuals who were released. And we were able to offer services from housing to food, connecting them with different networks for the folks that their families reached out and we knew. This, unfortunately, because it's a life or death situation, as I said, has also demonstrated that cash bail isn't really needed. Violent felonies did not go up. Rapes didn't go up, murders didn't go up. None of these things happened on why we seem to want to maintain the cash bail system in San Diego and in California. So that's what we saw. We also deal with the prison, and we saw over 3,000 people that currently have COVID, and I think about 14 of those individuals have died. One of the women we were working with who was homeless, we got her into permanent housing. Her husband's heart stopped. He was in one of the federal penitentiaries in San Diego. I want to say it's Lompoc. And they had about 80% of the people there who did contract COVID, and his heart literally stopped. She had no idea where her husband was the whole time he was in the hospital. So just dealing with these issues and families being ripped apart for nonviolent drug offenses, thinking that it's a public safety issue to keep them in jail when they could die, that was heartbreaking. We have a lot of work to do.
Thank you. On the front end, I'm wondering if you or Chelsea can talk about what police enforcement has looked like during this health crisis, whether it's been kind of feeding more people into the jails, or any other kind of law enforcement issues that you've come across in your work and solutions that you've advocated for in response.
Well, in regards to jails, actually, my colleague Esme can cover that part, and then I can cover the policing side.
Yeah, of course. I would just add to what Leila mentioned. Our office sent around 10 letters to probation departments, DAs, prisons, in conjunction with partners, with pillars. We follow their lead on some of them. And those letters included some basic recommendations on what they could do to release people and to provide PPE to folks who are incarcerated, and other measures that they can take. We never got a direct response from any of the agencies that we reached out to, but we know that some of the recommendations were put in place at a certain level too. We know that around 1,000 people were released between late March and early May from the sheriff's office. We know that's not enough, but at least those are like 1,000 people that are going to be safe, and they were safe in their home. And regarding the emergency bail schedule that the state put out through the Judicial Council, that meant that people's bail was reduced to 0. So they were supposed to be released so they could be safe at home and taking care of themselves. And a lot of people, I just want to emphasize that a lot of people are incarcerated because they cannot afford bail. So it's really important. This was a really important step. Unfortunately, the way that our local sheriff's office and the DA's office reacted was to challenge this order. It wasn't a mandatory order to implement, for lack of a better word, but around 500 people could have benefited from this emergency order, and instead the DA and the sheriffs decided to challenge around 100 of those cases and make sure that they didn't get a 0 bail amount, so that they could be free and safe from this health crisis.
Thanks, Esme. Chelsea, would you like to talk about the policing end of things now?
Yes, and can y'all hear me okay? I think my mic sometimes is off. Hear me okay? Okay, cool. So in terms of what we saw on the policing side when this pandemic hit, was like police taking liberties with surveillance issues. So we know that at least Chula Vista PD was interested in using their drones that they have invested in to do outreach to the homeless population. But we see police departments using this pandemic as an opportunity to infringe on people's privacy rights. And so another issue that we saw during this pandemic is how the homeless population was treated. Even before the pandemic, we've had this issue of police departments citing folks who are experiencing poverty or experiencing mental health issues, and giving them tickets for living on the street or for blocking the sidewalk. And even during this pandemic, San Diego PD showed that they're still ticketing for these same offenses when people really needed to shelter in place. And so there was some great reporting done by the Voice of San Diego that looked at the citation rates. And it showed that the citation rates for illegal lodging or encroachment were consistent with previous months before the pandemic hit. So essentially, the police didn't slow down or stop completely ticketing unhoused folks for sleeping on the street. And this is despite knowing that CDC guidelines were put out recommending that you don't sweep encampments, that the safest thing for people who are out on the street is for them to shelter in place, not to forcibly remove them or to make them go into a shelter. We also know that there was disparities in who gets enforced for wearing a mask and not wearing a mask. And I know there's at least examples nationally of Black people being afraid to wear a mask because they might seem suspicious, but then getting in trouble for not wearing a mask. And we've seen stories of people getting yanked off of buses for wearing a mask and not wearing a mask. And then in terms of here locally, we've seen the disparities in enforcement with protests. There was a protest in Otay Mesa, I believe in late March or early April, where the sheriff cited 3 protesters for violating the shelter-in-place ordinance. And then just a week later after that protest, there was a protest downtown, people responding to Trump's call to free the state. And they were protesting against this quarantine or the shelter-at-home order. And SDPD is not wearing riot gear, not spraying pepper spray, just calmly looking on and not enforcing any of the social distancing mandates that were in place at the time and still in place. So to highlight Andrea St. Julian, she wrote a great op-ed for the Voice of San Diego highlighting this selective enforcement of the stay-at-home order in San Diego.
Thanks, Chelsea. Layla, I'm wondering if there's anything you'd like to add in terms of solutions that Pillars has advocated for on the issue of police enforcement during this time, and also tell us about how local law enforcement has responded to your suggestions.
Stop putting people in jail. That's been one of our biggest suggestions. That's the best practice, and it follows what the medical experts are saying. In many cases, and we run public records requests on the district attorney and sheriff often. One of the things that we're seeing on the ground, and we're going to run a public records request, is the sheriff or the police departments purposely upcharging people to make sure that they don't qualify for the zero bail. So we're getting families, and we're hearing the stories, we're like, that was probable cause for that. Why did they charge you with that? We want to look a little deeper into that and also look at where these disparities existed on those charges. So if you give a person the difference between an assault and an assault with great bodily injury, or different things that they were utilizing, you didn't come home with cash with zero bail. You had to bail out. And then they went back to monetary bail though, because if you're middle class, you could bail out on a $50,000 bail with $5,000. So we just saw those disparities, and we're going to challenge some of those charges when the courts. We also wrote a letter to the actual courts. We're court watchers. We have no access to the courts. That is unfair, and it's unconstitutional. And they did provide a few of those courtrooms where you can actually monitor them now, but we can't see every courtroom. And so therefore, they're still not allowing access. And there's a lot of different cases. There are a lot of cases that we need to really look at right now because of the overcharging that we believe is happening and the plea bargains that are going on and the enhancement. So you're having some people where they're putting in a gang enhancement on something that has nothing to do with the gang, so that bail could be $100,000 more. And those are the different unfair ways we're seeing the police department or the sheriffs utilize how they get around that zero bail if they want to.
That's super troubling. And I think a good segue into our next topic, which is police accountability. Nationally, there's been a surge in public attention and conversation on issues of police misconduct, including police violence. And in particular, the death of George Floyd has had ripple effects across the nation. In addition, Breonna Taylor and Tony McDade are some of the more recent names added to the list of folks that have lost their lives to police violence. So Layla and Chelsea, could you please share with us some high-level thoughts or observation on what's been happening locally in San Diego with respect to issues of police violence?
Go ahead, Chelsea. You want me to go? One of the things, and I grew up in Southeast San Diego, in Canto to be specific, and one of the cases that has always been problematic is, and this I think was in the early 2000s, is Benny Venable. Billy Venable was murdered by a police officer in Southeast San Diego, and he was unarmed. And the district attorney at the time, Bonnie Dumanis, stated that he reached for the officer's gun. We just saw the same thing in Oak Park. He reached for the officer's gun. Forensics later said that there was no way possibly he could have physically reached for the officer's gun because the officer's gun was always scraping against, the officer was laying on his gun. And they saw that through the scrape marks on the concrete. So the officer said he has my gun, which he never had. He's reaching for my gun, which he never did. And he was then executed, and there was no wrongdoing. This same officer later was part of the Trinell Cannon a video of a young man who was brutalized by the gang suppression unit. He's now an investigator with a much higher job and gets paid much more, and is still abusing and brutalizing people in our community. And those are the issues that we have. It is very hard. If we look at the police officer who sexually assaulted so many women, I believe it's either 16, I think it went up to 20 something women who, and one of them said he forced her to orally copulate him. And our district attorney then changes his plea bargain right before changes the charges and plea bargains with him right before trial so that he would not have to go to prison and would not have to register as a sex offender. He was released for COVID-19. He was released, he's home right now, and I think he went to jail a month before COVID-19. And that's the disparities in sentencing. An officer, I know people who urinated outside and have to register as a sex offender in my community, but a police officer who does this to numerous women is then, the district attorney strategically changes his charges so that he does not have to do that. These are the reasons why we feel unsafe, because there's no accountability. And so if we look at Michael White, he's another person who was murdered by the police from my community. We look at Sergio Week and Jonathan Cornell, 2 unarmed men, 11 months apart, and no one's asking questions because they put the term gang member on them by the same officer. 2 unarmed men within 11 months are executed by the same gang detective, and no one questions it because all they have to do is say, gang member killed by police, and then we go on with our day. So those are some of the personal issues. Alfred Alongo, mental health, being in your most vulnerable situation in your life, and someone, instead of talking to you, a mental health expert, you have a police officer stalk you saying the F word over and over and over again, and then he ends up dead. Those are the issues that we have. Police officers not being trained for the work they do, some of them being sociopaths, like we saw in Minnesota, and like we see sometimes in San Diego, and just the institution itself. Police officers are here to enact force. That's their job, and that's what they do.
Thank you, Layla. That's super powerful. Also infuriating. Yeah, Chelsea, please add.
Yeah, and I want to thank Layla for lifting up some of the local names, because it's great that people are familiar with the story of George Floyd and other national stories outside of San Diego, but we have plenty of stories here that people should be familiar with and talking about and just as enraged by. And Layla already mentioned some of those names. And I just want to give a shout out to the March for Black Women organizers and the caravan that they did last week. I forgot, I lose track of the days, but on that caravan, names at each of the stops for the caravan were listed. And these are local examples of how that show that biased policing happens here in San Diego, and police violence is an issue here that we need to act on. And so some of those names that I want to lift up is Earl McNeil, Aaliyah Jenkins, Alfred Alongo, that Layla Aziz mentioned, Fredoon Nihad, Jonathan Cornell, and Raul Rivera. And this is just a short list. Honestly, I just, like Layla, some of the names that you mentioned earlier, I didn't know about those names. So, and that just kind of tells you how many people have been impacted by this issue locally that we need to pay attention to and be enraged about. And I guess like to point to some of the data that backs up these stories. Just yesterday or 2 days ago, KPBS did an analysis of 130 records from local police departments. And in their analysis of those use of force records, if the suspect is white, police are more likely to use alternative or less lethal methods of force. But if the suspect is a person of color, then they're more likely to shoot. Like that analysis should be enraging to everyone. And at the same time, this is old news. This is old news. We have previous reports done by SDSU, done by Campaign Zero, that point to bias policing being an issue in terms of who was stopped, who was searched, who was arrested, who has force used upon them, and who was even killed. And this was such an issue in our area that our local assembly member, Dr. Shirley Weber, along with the support of other families impacted by this issue, introduced AB 392 and fought hard for this bill because the killing of people by police is real and police need to be held accountable. And so I think that's where I'll end there. Like, we have all these stories. We also have so many reports locally, statewide, that reinforce that bias policing is an issue and that police violence lives here and is like living strong, just as it is in Ferguson, just as it is in Minneapolis, New York, LA, Bakersfield. Like we have work here to do.
Absolutely. Layla, I'm wondering if I could ask you to reflect on how some of these incidents of police violence that you and Chelsea uplifted that have happened locally, how they give context to the moment that we're in right now, right? We're in a pretty historic moment.
We are. I love and I always try to uplift women. When I looked at the Aaliyah Jenkins case, and we look at where we are now, and look at do we just dismantle this whole thing and throw it away, or can we train our way out of this, right? And I look at what happened to Aaliyah Jenkins, and I look at some of the things, the excuses that were used in her death. One of them was that in a traffic stop where she was a passenger, her name was run. Why? Ask yourself, if you live in a middle class or an affluent area, if your name has ever been run in a traffic stop, in a routine traffic stop. Have they gone to the passenger and asked you what your name was and run your name for a background check to see if you had warrants? That's not something that is normal, but it's something that is normal for Black and brown people, where everyone in the car will have a warrant check. Second thing, she had a small amount of drugs on her, and the police claimed that she swallowed the drugs. I have a friend who did that, and he is now a vegetable. He's still alive. He's been a vegetable in a convalescent home for about, one of those homes for about, I would say, 10 years now. He opens his eyes, but he's still a vegetable. Why would a person swallow drugs in order not to go to jail? Why is a person going to jail for drugs? Why is that the way that we deal with drug abuse, an addiction? Second thing, if a person told me I can't breathe, if a person told me I feel really sick, if a person threw up before I put them in my cop car, I would have due diligence in making sure that this person was okay, because I was going to now take their decision-making ability away. And Aaliyah said over and over, I can't breathe. I can't breathe. And he passed 3 or 4 hospitals to take her down to booking because she was an animal to him. And none of that was a problem by our district attorney. And so we look at that. Did he have his knee on her neck? No. But he watched her die, knowing he was the only person who could intervene because he took her freedom away. And those things are upsetting. And knowing that there's no way, there's nothing illegal in what this man did. And there was no wrongdoing, according to the DA. We've been dealing with this, from physical brutality to just watching you die in custody.
Thank you, Layla. Just want to kind of hold this moment for a minute. Yeah. Denora, I'm wondering if you can share about what are some statewide efforts that are going on right now to address this really deep and just, heartbreaking situation that we're in with police violence, and also some of the challenges that you've encountered.
First, thank you, Layla, for lifting the names, lifting the stories, and I can't speak on the statewide efforts. However, I think that we're in a challenging moment right now. I think as many other organizations, community leaders, activists, organizers, we're being forced to reimagine what real change needs to look like. And I think it all has to begin with internal dialogues and facing and I think one of the few blessings that COVID has given us is the inability to look away, the inability to look away and pretend like it's not happening, because you're forced to be at home and watch the news and watch the stories. My mother, who's an immigrant from El Salvador that only watches Spanish media, knows what happened to George Floyd. And she knows, and this is not something that I think she would have known if she could look away. Our statewide network is Pico, California, and we've been now in multi-year for many years working through a platform that we call HEAT, that's focused on the hiring, the equipment, accountability, and training of officers. that is rooted in looking at the current system and asking for these 4 points to be transformed or restructured. And to be honest, I think that one of the biggest challenges right now is to face and acknowledge that a lot of the work that we're doing might not be enough. And so I think that we're having to do a lot of internal work. And today, over 30 clergy from the county committed to doing a lot of internal work, primarily and uniquely inside white congregations, to have the internal dialogues about the systemic and historical racism that has led us to this moment, and that has been this moment for centuries now. So I think that we're in a moment right now to really invite clergy to have those internal dialogues and to serve in their congregations, to be not just the spokespeople, but that have a responsibility to move those dialogues forward. And I think to continue the work that we're doing that is looking at the hiring practices, that is looking at how people are being trained, and to say that it's not enough, that we have to reimagine and really think about ways that there's transformational change happening that goes beyond amendments and that goes beyond revisions to policies. And I'm going to admit, we have a long way to go. And I think I sit in a unique place where even for myself, as a Latina and a Latina directing an organization, that I feel a responsibility to hold dialogues with my community, con la gente, to also talk about the history of Black people in this country, recognizing the challenges of our own, but that we cannot erase and we cannot look away. So I think that we're really either in a pivotal moment, and I believe that if we just sit back and not act, we would be making a great mistake. But I think I'm hopeful that we are being forced to look at the mirror and look in front of us, and to imagine much more courageous conversations and much more courageous transformational systemic change. So, and I'm sorry, I'm not fully addressing your question, but I and not to just piggyback, but I think that we deserve to honor the moment that we're living in, and also recognize that it's not new, and recognize that we've been here long before, and that our Black brothers and sisters have been saying this for so long, and that it took this moment to be still, where we were forced to be still, to finally look and to finally have to listen. So I feel a sense of responsibility, and I know that as a part of a statewide network, we're also having to reimagine where we're directing our work, and how we're having challenging and tense conversations with our clergy, with faith leaders that I know are willing to step in and step up. But there's a lot of work to do. So I'll leave it at that.
If I could maybe bring in also some information about like how local leadership has responded to the situation that we're in. So we've seen recently the mayor and the police chief, as well as the sheriff, come out and say like, oh, hey guys, guess what? We're addressing this issue. We are going to ban carotid restraint and like just leave it at that. And thankfully, we've seen community members say like, no, that is not enough to say you won't choke us. And we know that there are issues. Another example, Amari Johnson in La Mesa, who got stopped by the police and arrested for resisting arrest, according to the officer, when we saw from the video that that's not the case. Like, it's not enough to say we're not going to use this one technique to address this issue of people being stopped, searched, and maimed and killed by the police. It takes much more than that. And so like Denora mentioned, like we need transformational change. We need to reimagine the role of police in our communities and where maybe they should not be. And also just want to like uplift like the work that people are doing to really push that conversation. And that's work that community members are doing to like say, hey, like, what if we didn't use police to respond to these issues? And I'm encouraged to see like that conversation, being in the room of city council rooms for 11 to 12 hours at a time. So I just wanted to like lift that up, and I hope that our local leadership hears the community when we say that we don't want more police.
Thank you, Chelsea, and thank you to you and Layla and Denora for helping us reflect on this huge problem, and while also uplifting specifically what it looks like and how it's impacted people in San Diego, and pointing us towards the bold solutions, or the bold questions that I think we really need to be grappling with right now. I'm going to turn us to Q&A because I'm sure that our audience has a ton of questions for you all. So I guess we'll start with the question of what can people tuning in today specifically do to make a difference in holding San Diego PD and the Sheriff's Department accountable?
Organize. Get with an organization that you feel comfortable with, that shares your same values, but that also works on criminal justice and police accountability reform or dismantling. I like dismantling. That might not be for everyone, but get with an organization. You have people like the ACLU, you have people like Surge, you have Pillars, you have the Racial Justice Coalition. There are plenty, and I'm sure, and you can just call them and ask them what their principles are, their values are, and see the best one, the best fit for you. Volunteer and help us take down this unjust system.
That's a great question that segues into the next one, which is some audience members want to know what's the best way to keep up with the work that Pillars is doing and to support your work.
Thank you so much. We do court watching. So we have a need when the courts open back up and they're safe, and hopefully they'll be practicing social distancing also there, but to really monitor what they're doing at one of the courts. And we have 4 here. So depending on where you live, we match people with the most convenient court, and court support, helping families navigate through that. That's one of the scariest situations a person will be in their life. Wondering if they'll be free, if they'll go to prison, if they'll be there to see their child born. And so helping and being a support there, I think that's where our biggest need is. And we do have a police accountability program. It's very Southeast specific though, where we actually monitor the cops and we help people complain. We file with internal affairs and the CRB. Our CRB is pretty weak. Hopefully somebody will talk a little bit about that later, but there's a lot that you can do, please. We love volunteers.
Thanks. The next question's for Chelsea, and it's to ask you to address CPAT, and maybe you can break down what that CPAT acronym means, and
Sure.
where the progress is at and what more needs to be done.
Absolutely. So CPAT is the Coalition for Police Accountability and Transparency. Pillars is a coalition member as well. We also have members from the LGBT Center, LB Gilliam Bar Association, La Raza Lawyers Association, SDOP, several. And we have been working on a policy package called Police Accountability Now. And it consists of 5 policies, and I guess I'll go over it real quick. The first is passing a law called Protect. We already have it drafted and ready to go on the books. And this law would make it harder for police to stop and search people, because we know that bias disparities in our stop and search is an issue. And we just want to limit that contact between the police and the communities that they're harming. And so this would create a higher legal standard. The second one is decriminalizing low-level offenses and divesting from the police budget and using that money towards non-law enforcement community-led responses. And we already see some of those responses in our community. I know Tasha Williamson has like hotels for vouchers, like program. Like these are community-based programs that have like sprung up and met a need to like help people. And so we need to support that. The third one is having a strong civilian oversight board. what we have right now isn't where it needs to be. And right now, there's a charter amendment where people are advocating for a commission on police practices that has investigatory powers, that has access to independent counsel and subpoena powers, which is key because we know that police don't like to share their documents and don't like to tell the truth. They like to hide stuff. So we want to make sure that we get the documents and know what's really going on, what really happened in that body cam footage. The fourth and fifth one is adopting a strong use of force policy and a de-escalation policy. And so those are the things that we're working on, and I can actually drop a link in the chat where you can send an email action to your local electeds telling them to adopt all 5, because we don't need piecemeal change, we don't need 1, we don't need 2, we need all 5, and that's just a start. So I'll drop the link for y'all to participate.
Thanks. And one question we had from our audience in that I think you can address in the context of this kind of platform, but also just generally, is what is the best way to pressure local politicians to force changes in the way that police operate?
I'm gonna open that question up because I feel like a lot of people have thoughts and ideas. For me, like calling them, emailing them, making them being in long council meetings because you guys have jammed the phone lines. Like we've seen some great strategies from organizers locally of like how to drill home your message and what the community wants and needs. But I'll open it up to other people who want to respond to that as well.
I like what you said, but more really what we try to do is we try to take people who've never ever talked to a legislature, never talked to a council person, and have them and prepare them to go and building power within our community. So I multiply myself by 10 and that person multiplies themselves by 10 and building power. I think that's one of the most important things, and everything else Chelsea said.
I want to add one more. Run for office. You know, we don't just need white people in the office. So we need to be in positions of power to make the decisions instead of always asking.
I would agree, all those things. And the only thing I would add is also share stories, tell your story, and go get your 10 people and have them share their stories. We have to change the narrative, and we keep losing the narrative, not just locally. That's how we're losing on a national level too. So tell the stories, telling the stories about every single story that Layla just shared with us, moved us, because we know that that those are real, not just the lies that we hear from the other sides or sometimes even our own allies. So we got to shift the narrative and show up, make the phone calls and tell your story, and then bring your 10 family members, 10 friends, and have them tell their stories too.
Thank you. Well, I found that inspiring. I hope you all did too. The next question is kind of the big question of the moment, which is, what do you think of the idea of divesting from police in this moment? And where would you want to see funds that are divested from police reallocated? That's for everybody.
I don't want to take up so much space. Come on, Esmeralda.
No, you're good. Take as much space as you want. That's the point of this conversation today. I'll just kick it off. I think it's important that that we invest in what our community needs. And I think it's been clear from all of the brilliant participations tonight that we don't need more police. We don't need police terrorizing our communities. We don't need police using tear gas. We don't need police using rubber bullets. We don't need police cooperating with immigration, with ICE, with CBP in peaceful protests. We don't need them with military gear. We need investments in our schools. We need investments in our healthcare. We need other economic predictions, childcare, other things that are way more important and that would solve a lot of the issues that our communities have been dealing with many years because of lack of investment in the right things for our communities.
Any other thoughts on that question?
I agree. First of all, we need to take a look at what are the police for. And some people have some feel-good stories about the police. They have some nice coffee stories about coffee with the cop. And those are probably things that have happened, and they do happen. But what is the purpose of the police? The police are here to maintain the government's policies and laws through force. That's why they're here. That's why you get tickets. And if you don't comply, you'll be on the ground, you'll be thrown in jail. That's why they'll come to you if they say your noise is too loud. If you're having a mental health crisis, you're doing something that violates something that the law says, and you could end up dead. And that's the purpose of the police. So we need to look at the purpose that we want for our community. And are we still embracing the broken windows policy? Because a lot of the police's time is issuing tickets and enforcing very low level things that end up being escalated because communities feel as though it's oppressive because it has always been oppressive. The purpose of the police hasn't changed from the end of slavery and the slave patrols through Jim Crow, Black codes, and now through policing Black and brown people, through policing immigrants, non-white immigrants. These are all historical things from the Chinese Exclusion Act and everything else that was criminalized. Our bodies are criminalized within the system. So for me to look at a system that does not have the police and then look at, well, what am I going to do with murderers and rapists? Those are things that don't scare me. Because right now, rapists in my community don't get help by the police. So for me to really be able to do something with a rapist is something that I would want. We have rape test kits that aren't even tested, but I know people in my community, no one has their rapist who's been in prison. That's not something that happens. So looking at policing, my day-to-day and everyone's day-to-day interaction with them has to do with them getting money for the state, ticketing me for something, or arresting me for something that's a low-level crime. I can definitely see that money used in mental health, in substance abuse, in education. I think they can defund the police like they defunded education. That's what they should have defunded from the beginning.
Thanks, Layla. I also want to give some space for questions about bail and jail and decarceration. Folks are really concerned that people are still being imprisoned in this time. And so there's some questions about what's going on with the emergency $0 cash bail schedule. And also folks want to know what they can do to help support getting rid of cash bail and also to support people who are inside right now.
Yeah, of course. I can talk a little bit about that, but folks can feel free to come in. So the emergency bail schedule that I mentioned earlier, there was a measure that the Judicial Council took as a response to COVID-19. Sadly, they ended that provision yesterday. So what that means is that people are still going to be held, and the only difference right now is that people who can afford bail are going to get out, but the people who can't afford bail are going to be still detained until their situation resolves in the court. So obviously, that's something that decision was really sad for us to hear, but our local courts have the capacity to change that if they want. So that's something that our local elected officials and our local courts can change if they want to, if we had like the political will. But as I mentioned before, we also had the sheriffs and the DA oppose the zero bail and challenge 100 cases, even during a health crisis. So that's really concerning when they're putting, when they don't have their priorities straight and they don't have the best interest of people and preserving people's lives. It's not a priority for them.
Thanks. Any more thoughts on ways we can support people inside right now, or ways we can stop the unfair imposition of money bail right now?
Donate to a bail fund. We were extremely blessed that our bail fund, we thought we were going to raise a certain amount of money, that because we've been doing this for a little over a year, and the people really showed up. And so we're at the point where we're looking at how we can really, as this zero bail is taken away because of the courts, and how we're going to lobby Superior Court to maintain a zero bail schedule, which they're not going to do. We know we're going to lose that battle, and maybe the ACLU will sue them for us. But how we can demonstrate through storytelling why cash bail isn't needed. And some of that's going to be through storytelling that makes us uncomfortable. And one of those storytelling is going to be domestic violence. That's personally one of the things that affects me, because I'm a victim of domestic violence. And I really believe women and trans women, we should be protected. And we are very high, women of color, trans women are very high on domestic violence or partner abuse, intimate partner violence. And how do we go in there and we work with that person who did harm, who was incarcerated, who's in jail? And that's kind of looked at as being safe at that moment because tempers are up. And how do we utilize community trauma-informed care, have community members that are trained in holding people accountable and working with them and seeing what are some of the underlying issues that are causing these things without using the jail system. So you're going to see that coming from us, and you're going to see it in a safe way. We're not bailing out anybody on domestic violence and just letting them hit the streets and go kill somebody, because that's not accountable. And we would have to be held accountable if you did. But you will see us picking people up, monitoring them, making sure that they're in a hotel room, making sure we're talking to both parties. Just statistically, unfortunately, and I had to learn this the hard way, myself when I was younger, they get back together and they're going to continue the relationship. And so how do we as a community really step in front of something like that and reduce that harm without policing and without jails?
That's amazing. I've got to wrap us up. I'm really sorry if I couldn't get to your question, but we're kind of running short on time. I'm also really sad that I couldn't ask all of your questions and hear more from our amazing panelists, but that's the situation we're in. But I'd really like to again thank our panelists for everything you've shared today, and also ask you to leave us with some closing words and actions tonight. So maybe we can start with you, Denora.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me on here. I, as much as I've shared, also have learned so much, and I'm really inspired to keep working. These days are pretty tough, and so I'm filled with all the work and the spirit and generosity that you've shared today. And the only last action item or action steps I could say is we have to vote in November. We have to, and start the work right now. I think we're seeing, and we're gonna see the manipulation of decision making over the next couple of months to influence what will happen in November. We got to get our family members and become a voting majority to really transform San Diego and for that to be sustainable. And I know it's everyone saying it, but really investing in each other, the ones that aren't, the ones that can't, the unnaturalized that are just an application fee away from becoming citizens to be able to vote, the young people that are frustrated and don't see the hope, and finding ways to inspire them and to get them to the polls or to vote by mail, and investing in organizations like Pillars, and organizations like others that are doing the work on the ground that really could be bringing those resources to the communities that are most impacted. So that's all I would say. And thank you.
Thank you. Esme, you want to go next?
Sure. Well, thank you to everyone. As Dinora mentioned, this panel was great. I learned a lot too. It's always great to connect with folks who are doing different work and sometimes even more important work than what you're doing. So this has been like amazing to be a part of. I would just emphasize that, we all know that no one, whether they're like a citizen or an immigrant, should be living in this condition. Incarceration is not the response, not and much less during a health crisis. So the ACLU nationwide created like a predictive model along with academic researchers that shows that 306 people in our jails are predicted to die from COVID-19. Locally. So we need to take action to decarcerate folks, whether it's immigration detention, whether it's in our jails, in our prisons, but we need to take action now. And one of the things that we have been calling for the last couple of weeks is to put pressure on our local leadership to call Otay Mesa Detention Center, to call the San Diego Sheriff's Office, to call the district attorney, to call the probation department, for them to act and release as many of folks as they're possible. There, we know, as Leila mentioned previously, with the emergency bail schedule, even though it's going to end on June 20th, we know that it worked. We know that people, we know that the crime rate didn't go up, which is always like a talking point from our law enforcement and our district attorneys. We know that didn't happen. We know that's not true. We know that we are not less safe just because people are being released on bail. So we know that it works, and we know that it can be done, and we know that they have the power locally to keep on doing that to preserve lives. So that would be our call to action right now, to call leadership, demand them to release people from detention, whether it's immigration or the jails. And then, as we mentioned earlier, donate to funds, local funds who are supporting people who can afford bail. We have immigration bonds. We have the fund that Leila mentioned. There's a lot of community-led efforts that could use our support, and they're doing great work that some of the organizations don't have the capacity to do. So it's great to partner up and support their efforts to get these immediate results for individual people every day in our communities.
Thanks, Esme. Leila, any final words you want to leave us with?
They said it all of the above. I personally am going to, because it always starts with self-criticism with me, self-accountability. I'm going to find time to volunteer with SDOP.
Thanks, Leila. Chelsea, you want to close us out?
Sure. I'll just leave y'all with a couple of things. One, don't be satisfied with piecemeal change or people in power coming out saying, oh, we're going to do this, and then hope that that sends people home and that there's no more protests in the streets. Like, we got to look at people's records. We got to look at what they've been saying when we've confronted them with evidence before there was national news or cameras showing what's happening in the streets. We got to look at that. And we got to be bold in reimagining what policing looks like in our communities and dismantle that and reimagine something that centers people's humanity, that preserves life. And then the third thing I'll say is follow the leadership of people who've been doing this work. And often you'll find that that's been Black women and Black people who have been impacted by this issue and know it from a personal level and are experts in it on multiple levels. So identify, Leila mentioned a lot of organizations in this call, and you have some here with you today. Like, find those local organizations who have been dedicated to this issue from the get-go before it was, front page last week or 2 weeks ago. Follow the leadership of that organization and plug into the work that they are doing.
Thank you, everybody. I wish we could give you a round of applause. You really deserve one. But thank you all again for all the information you shared with us and for the work that you continue to do for our community on decarceration and policing issues. For those joining us, our audience, I hope this webinar was informative and inspired you to take action, especially the actions our panelists shared. At the close of this webinar, you'll be directed to a survey where you can share feedback with us. Please do complete that survey so we can improve this webinar experience as we move through it. As I mentioned, this is the second of 5 webinars. Next week, we'll be talking about making ends meet. So it'll be a discussion on the economic and housing protections that working families in our region need and how we can fight for them. So thank you all for joining us this evening as we continue our work to flatten the curve of inequality. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to the interpreter too.